Our children's message this morning was about trust, and in a very real sense, epistemic justice is about trust and trustworthiness. It involves good intentions, intentionality, accountability. I contend that all those things go together, and of course that means that we need to understand what accountability really is, moment by moment and day by day. And to explain, I'll start with a troubling story. Back in 1993, two young black men were waiting at a bus stop in London, England. 6 white teenagers on the other side of the street began to shout at them. And one of the black men, Dwayne Brooks, got scared and began to run. And then, to Brooks's horror, the young men charged across the street, caught Brooks's friend, Stephen Lawrence, and stabbed him to death. Police quickly arrived, and I believe the officers did intend to solve the crime. They had good intentions, but they assumed they already knew what had happened, a gang fight. They assumed that rather than being victims of deadly violence, the two black men had been participants, equally responsible for the violence inflicted on them. And while the police were interrogating Dwayne Brooks, Stephen Lawrence's murderers got clean away. Witnesses came forward to explain what had really happened, and it turned out that the white gang had been on a rampage attacking black people that whole evening. Even so, 20 years would go by before the murderers were even brought to trial. And it was so messed up, Parliament called for an inquiry, and they found that the officers had violated their own protocols. They had failed to provide aid to the crime victims. Dwayne Brooks had tried to tell them what happened, but they had ignored his information. In philosophical terms, Brooks was a knower. He knew what had happened, but because of bias against him as a black man, police refused to listen. And the inquiry found that the root cause was, of course, entrenched structural racism within the London police force. With structural racism, like a lot of structural isms, good intentions are not the problem. But officers did not allow people of color respect as knowers. They did not trust them due to their own biased feelings, which many officers might not have even realized they had. And this sort of thing happens all the time, of course, on both sides of the Atlantic. Black citizens here in the United States complain that they are treated differently by police, by other agencies, and even by the medical establishment. And scientific research has confirmed that these complaints are, in fact, accurate. Nor does this kind of unequal treatment apply just to black people. The same prejudices play out in various forms for all people of color, as well as for gender nonconforming people, people with disabilities, and still, all too often, women. Feminist philosopher Miranda Fricker tells this story about Dwayne Brooks and Stephen Lawrence as an example of what she calls testimonial epistemic injustice. Epistemology is the study of knowledge, how we learn what we learn, and in this case, what we think we know that is just not true, but which prevents us from finding out what we need to know. Testimonial epistemic injustice, those are big words, but they describe a common part of the human experience. The human brain, we saw a bit of that in the children's lesson this morning. The human brain uses unconscious shortcuts to process input and make decisions. But because we do this unconsciously, we too often find ourselves acting on cultural assumptions rather than the facts in front of us. In the case of the Stephen Lawrence murder, biased police assumptions that this had been a gang fight because black men are violent prevented them from listening to the real facts about the crime. Good intentions don't mean much without accountability. Unitarian Universalism is a strongly covenantal tradition, but I submit that our covenantal declarations don't mean much without accountability. Unitarian Universalist theologian James Luther Adams, one of my favorites, taught that a covenant is a sincere, ethical promise willingly entered into by equals, and that it is rooted in love, not law. That is, violation of a covenant is a problem not because it breaks an enforceable law, but because it is a violation of trust. It's a breach of faith. So, covenantal relationship is rooted in love, not law. So if we're talking about love instead of law, what does accountability even mean for us? And to me, accountability means this: we need to listen, particularly to people who are treated unfairly, whether it be an individual in an unequal relationship or a whole population. People of color, LGBTQ plus people, people with disabilities, and let's not forget old people and women. That's all testimonial epistemic injustice really is, or epistemic justice really is. Listen to marginalized voices, listen, pay attention, be trustworthy. There is another kind of epistemic injustice, what Miranda Fricker calls hermeneutical epistemic injustice, and that's harder to explain. In philosophy, hermeneutics is the science of interpretation, and Fricker applies this to knowledge and information. Knowledge and information can very much be a justice issue. For example, suppose the people in a poor section of town don't have the information they need to register to vote. If they don't, then their right to vote has in effect been taken away. And that lack of knowledge is hermeneutic epistemic injustice. And therefore, working to provide that information is hermeneutic justice. One more subtle example of hermeneutic injustice comes from Miranda Fricker herself. She writes about the beloved American novel and the movie made from the novel, To Kill a Mockingbird. As an example, she writes about it as an example of testimonial injustice. A black man, Tom Robinson, is accused of assaulting a white woman in 1930s Alabama. Both he and the novel's hero, Atticus Finch, explain to the jury how that could not possibly have happened, but the racist jury refuses to listen to them. Okay, that's testimonial injustice. But To Kill a Mockingbird itself and the way Fricker uses it are also a perfect example of hermeneutic injustice. For the record, film critic Roger Ebert savaged that movie because of the way the movie and also the book treated their black characters. They have no life or function of their own other than, as Ebert puts it, to act as props, quote, backdrops in a story about a brave white liberal Atticus Finch, close quote. And this assessment of both the book and the movie still surprises some people, even today. But when I first preached about it in the early 2000s, I got strong pushback from a lot of people. It was very difficult to explain convincingly the kind of self-righteous liberal racism that pervades both the book and the movie. And in her writing on epistemic injustice, Miranda Fricker, the philosopher, also fails to recognize that structural racism. And then came groundbreaking black film director Spike Lee, who coined the language to explain what was going on. The black handyman, Tom Robinson, is what Lee calls a magical Negro. And the magical Negro is only there to help develop a story about the white hero. In To Kill a Mockingbird, once Tom Robinson has fulfilled that function, the plot conveniently kills him off. And none of the white characters worry much about that. It was never the point of the story, and he was never more than a prop. His death doesn't really matter to the book's outcome or the movie's. Meanwhile, the character of Atticus Finch, the heroic white lawyer, is what Spike Lee calls a white savior. The black townsfolk in the story cannot help themselves. Both the novel and the movie assume there were no black lawyers in the 1930s, so the white hero bravely steps in to try to save Tom Robinson. Now, for the record, there were black law schools and black lawyers in the 1930s. They might have, for example, asked future Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall. He was, during the novel's time frame, starting out as a crusading civil rights lawyer. And believe me, a black lawyer would totally have changed the plot of that book, maybe with Atticus Finch as an assistant. Okay? The book and movie just ignored that possibility, most likely because it never occurred to them. Magical Negroes and white saviors are now recognized as racist cliches. But when Ebert wrote his review, and later when I was trying to preach about it, that language didn't yet exist to explain those concepts, and Miranda Fricker herself didn't pick up on it. And that's what hermeneutic in justice is, a void in necessary knowledge about a justice issue. Now, for the record, To Kill a Mockingbird is a wonderful book, and it's a fine movie, and both were arguably as anti-racist as they could be in the early 1960s and still be accepted at all. But looking back, we can now see that both are examples how something can be anti-racist on one level, and yet by centering white characters, reinforce structural racism at a deeper level. And we're learning more about this stuff all the time. And that's really what hermeneutic justice is. Which brings us to something else Miranda Fricker talks about, which is essential to epistemic justice, what she calls the right to contest, the right to contest, the right to be heard if you believe you've been unfairly treated, or if you feel you're being denied information you need. The right to contest, she tells us, fundamentally changes a relationship, the right to contest. The more powerful person in the relationship may have good intentions, but they will act differently if they're accountable for their actions toward the less powerful person. Intentionality, trustworthiness requires good intentions plus accountability. They need to go together. Now, there's a tension between the right to contest on one side versus what Fricker calls a culture of domination on the other side. And one example she uses is in the United Kingdom, a law passed decades ago that made marital rape a crime. And she explains that even in a marriage where the husband would never even think of committing marital rape, that law changed the institution of marriage. It weakened the patriarchal culture of domination and granted women a greater right to contest across the board. And I kind of apologize that we have to juggle these big words and abstract academic language, but as you can see, these are really very basic, deeply personal issues. They play out every day, all around us. The new Article 2 language in our Unitarian Universalist Association bylaws says in part, "Love is the power that holds us together and is at the center of our shared values. We are accountable to one another for doing the work of living our shared values through the spiritual discipline of love." Close quote. We are accountable to one another. And that brings us right back to epistemic justice, because that's what accountability is in covenantal relationship, practicing epistemic justice, honoring the right to contest by listening, and particularly by listening to marginalized voices. Those voices have much to teach, both in society and within our own religious tradition. And we can live into the fact that there always is more to learn. I think it's easy to forget sometimes that nationwide, we Unitarian Universalists have thousands of members who are Asian, Hispanic, Indigenous, and/or Black. We have thousands of LGBTQ plus members. We have thousands of members with disabilities. And we need to listen to those experiences too. We need to listen to that knowledge. And we haven't always done that as well as we might. In an article about epistemic justice, Mexican sociologist Sylvia Schmelkes writes, "The notion of lifelong, life-wide learning presupposes acknowledge the existence of very diverse sources of knowledge, many ways of knowing, and the need for dialogue as the principal method for ensuring both deep learning and personal and collective growth." Diversity, dialogue, and personal and collective growth. Isn't that precisely what we tell people what we're about? In other words, to honor and engage the pluralism and diversity we already have calls for epistemic justice, particularly toward members and would-be members who are outside what we may view as our cultural mainstream. If I say something hurtful toward, say, a transgender person or a person of color or toward a woman, and I have done unintentionally, but even unintentionally, they should have the right to tell me. They should have the right to contest. What are my good intentions worth if I don't take time to listen? And to me, that's a crucial part of what accountability even means in a covenantal relationship. And to me, that is also an ethical call. As a totally Northern European descended lifelong member of the Mid-America vanilla set, I am called to be curious, to be interested in learning about people unlike myself. Covenantal accountability ethically calls me to listen to people unlike myself, particularly people on the margins. Epistemic justice. And if I practice that, all the pieces begin to fall into place. 200 years ago, Reverend William Ellery Channing was the leading Unitarian intellectual of his day, and he wrote a whole book on the hottest moral issue of his time, slavery. And frankly, it is hard to read that book today without gagging. Channing had really good intentions. He opposed slavery on philosophical grounds, but he also accepted every rationalization for slavery the white slaveholders gave him. Brilliant though Channing was, it never occurred to him to ask an enslaved person what slavery was like. His good intentions fell on barren ground because he was still part of an American culture of domination in which enslaved people had no right to contest, no right to describe how they felt about slavery. People are the experts on their own lives, we hear. William Ellery Channing, kind-hearted, well-intentioned, brilliant man though he was, didn't think about what an enslaved person would know about their own lives that he didn't already know. Epistemic injustice. We 21st century Unitarian Universalists are not immune to that. The Unitarian Universalist Association had a huge blow-up over unequal hiring practices back in 2017, and I submit that it blew up precisely because people of color at that time had no functional way to contest sloppy, unequal hiring practices. It wasn't about good intentions. We had the very best intentions. But the human condition is that, like Channing, we don't know what it is we don't know, until we give someone a chance to tell us. To avoid a culture of domination, whether it's intentional or not, I must pay attention to what someone tells me about how my actions affected their life. Accountability. We all need to remember to listen when someone tells us about their life. We need to help one another listen. In Scientific American magazine's terms, we must stand up for the silenced and stand with the silence breakers, even when they're talking to us. Learning new stuff is actually one of the coolest things we human beings do, and I love what happens when we take a hard look at how we've always done things and see where we could do better. In covenantal relationship terms with our own diversity, the study of epistemic justice gives Unitarian Universalists a language to understand what we've been groping at for the last several decades, trying to better communicate and accommodate marginalized voices within our own tradition. Our national culture is rife with misinformation and miscommunication. We need a language to explain how that is not okay. And our understanding of the world around us always is evolving. We need to evolve with it. Society's biggest problems come when people fail to adapt to new information. I'll say that again. Society's biggest problems come when people fail to adapt to new information. 2 words: climate change. And that's epistemic injustice in a nutshell, when people fail to adapt to new information. So here's to evolution. May we continue to evolve as our knowledge and language evolve. Amen. May it be so.